Welcome back to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. In our last video, we looked at the exile and return of the children of Israel, and we saw how both the northern and southern kingdom, because of their sin, both went into captivity. The northern kingdom, after 200 years of history, were taken into captivity by Assyria in 721 and scattered out among the nations. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted about 100 years longer. And they didn't go into Assyria, but into Babylonian captivity, because the Babylonians had conquered both Assyria and Egypt. And Nebuchadnezzar came in 3 waves against Judah. He came in 606. This was when Daniel and the wealthiest people were taken into captivity. He came a second time in 597. This was when the prophet Ezekiel and a second group of captives were taken. And Nebuchadnezzar came one final time in 586. This was when Zedekiah, the last king, rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He tried to go behind his back to make an alliance with Egypt. Because of that, Nebuchadnezzar came in his fury and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and left only the poorest sort of people left in Judea there to farm the land. Now, we also saw that the prophet Jeremiah had predicted that Judea would go into Babylonian captivity, but they would only be there for a period of 70 years. And after that 70-year captivity, the Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylon, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, issued a decree in 536 allowing God's people to return to the Promised Land. Now, most of the Jewish people stayed scattered out in the Gentile world from the time of Assyria and the time they were scattered by the Babylonian. But a man by the name of Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of David, was made governor of the land, and he led a group of 50,000 back to Judea to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. In the beginning, only the foundation was laid in 520 BC, but then by 516 the temple was built. Then in between here, it was the time of Queen Esther around 580. And then we see in 458, this would have been the time of Ezra, the scribe, that he led a second group of captives back. And then in 444 was the time of Nehemiah, cupbearer to the king of Persia. He led a third group back, and he helped in the rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And this leads us up to the time of Malachi, the last prophet to prophesy before the 400-year silence separating the Old and the New Testament. And I hope I got that date right with Esther. She would have been around 480 BC, in between or before the time of Ezra. It would have been the time of Queen Esther. We're actually going to be looking at this same period, but we're going to be looking at it in reference to the prophets. So have your phone ready, again, to take a screenshot of those prophets, as it's a chart that's going to be very useful to you. But I want to just review this time again, how the map changed during this time of the divided kingdom and then the captivities. During the time of the divided kingdom, you had the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, in the land of Canaan. Then, as the Assyrians came to power, we said that during the time of the divided kingdom, you had the 2 great powers were Assyria to the north and Egypt to the south. Well, it was in 721 the Assyrians came down and took that northern kingdom into captivity. And the map would look like this. You'd had the northern kingdom gone and only the southern kingdom of Judah left for the next 100 years. But then, as a result of the Babylonians coming to power, because they'd have come down and conquered Judah then and taken them into captivity, and you would then have the rise of the Persians. And so the Persians, they would have conquered Babylon and established another great world empire. And this was an important archaeological discovery I referred to last time. It's called Cyrus's Cylinder. It actually tells of the fall of Babylon to the Medo-Persian Empire. And once Cyrus issued his decree for God's people to return to the land of Palestine, this is what you would have had. You'd have had just, again, the enemies of God's people established here in the land, being placed there by foreign governors. But then you'd have had a small group of captives here in Judea coming back to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. So again, we're going to look at this same area, this same period of the divided kingdom. We're going to see how it looks, a chart that represents the prophets. So if you have your phone, I'm going to hold this up. You might want to do a screenshot of the prophets. And so what you have, after the time of the United Kingdom, when you had the division between the northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah, this would have been the time of Elijah and Elisha. These were two of the non-writing prophets, but we read about Elijah in the end of 2 Kings and also beginning of 1 Kings, and we read about, of course, Elisha in the book of 2 Kings. So Elijah at the end of 1 Kings, and then Elijah and Elisha in the book of 2 Kings. Then we have the prophets divided in the different groupings. If you remember on our chart about the prophets, we had 5 what we call major prophets and 12 of the minor prophets. Well, these are all included on this chart. 2 of the minor prophets, Hosea and Amos, were sent by God to prophesy against the northern kingdom of Israel. 2 prophets were sent to prophesy against Assyria. Jonah is probably one of the most famous of the prophets, and we know that when Jonah preached against Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, that the people actually believed his message and repented. And Jonah's kind of an unusual prophet. He was one of the most reluctant prophets, because when God told him to go north and preach against Nineveh, he went the other way, west. He tried to run away from God, and of course we know the story how God brought him back. But we find that in that book, the reason was that Jonah knew that God was a merciful God, and because the Assyrians had been their enemies and they were Gentiles, he didn't want the people to be saved. An important lesson we learned from the book of Jonah, and it is that God's concerned for all people. It's true that the Jews were his chosen people, and he had planned to bring Christ into the world through the Jewish people. But this is just one of many places in the Bible that we show that God is concerned with all people. And so in the time of Jonah, the people of Nineveh repented, and so the city was spared. But then by the time of Nahum, and 100 years later, Nineveh actually fell. That's when they fell to the Babylonians. Some of the early prophets in Judah were Joel, Obadiah, Micah, and Isaiah. Joel is a short book. Talks about a locust plague that is really symbolic of the destruction that's going to come upon Judah. Obadiah is a short book where God actually speaks out against one of their neighbors, the people of Edom. Micah and Isaiah were contemporaries. Isaiah is the prophet of the court. He's very close to the king, and we see him very close, like to the king Hezekiah. But Micah was more of a prophet of the country, so I would call him the country prophet, but they were contemporaries of one another. Also, we know Isaiah as the messianic prophet because he made so many prophecies about the coming Messiah. Some of the later prophets were Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah, and these would have been prophets prophesying closer to the time of the Babylonian captivity, so they were in the last days of Judah. Jeremiah actually lived through the captivity, and he remained with those poorest people that were left in the land by the Babylonians. During captivity, the two books are Ezekiel and Daniel, and we're going to spend a lot of time later in the book of Daniel, because although we said there was this period of 400 years silence between the Old and New Testament, God didn't leave us without instruction or without information about what was going to happen, because through the prophecies made in the book of Daniel, God tells exactly what's going to happen after captivity through this period of silence leading up to the time of Christ. So we'll be going into detail that later. But for now, just know that during captivity you had Ezekiel and Daniel. Then after captivity you had three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. I mentioned that when the captives first returned from captivity, they only laid the foundation of the temple, but because of the enemies of God, the work was put on hold. They didn't finish building the temple, and it was in 520 BC that Haggai and Zechariah came on the scene and encouraged the people to get back to work building the temple. And so then in 4 short years, from 520 to 516, the people actually rebuilt the temple there in Jerusalem. And then, of course, as we have mentioned before, Malachi will be the last prophet to prophesy before this 400-year silence. And one of the last prophecies he's going to make is about the coming of Elijah, that is actually a prophecy about the coming of John, who would prepare the way for Jesus. Now, we see a pattern in these prophets throughout, and that is that they all had a message for the people of their day. And many times they would also address the neighboring nations around Israel. They would have messages about Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Syrians, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians. But also what we find in the prophets is that they also look forward to the coming of Christ. We have two important passages in the New Testament. When the book of Hebrews began, it says that God at time past spoke to the fathers by the prophets, but has in these last days spoken to us through his Son. Also in 1 Peter chapter 1, when Peter is talking about these prophets of the Old Testament, he said that the Spirit of Christ was actually working in these Old Testament prophets, and that the Spirit of Christ who was working in these prophets, they said the Spirit of Christ was working in them, foretelling things concerning himself. In other words, these prophets foretold about the coming of Christ and about the church, the spiritual kingdom that exists today. And Peter also describes these things as things that angels desire to look into. So as you go through your study of the Bible, this chart on the prophet will, like your chart of the kings, I'm sure will be very helpful to you. So I hope that this lesson has been beneficial. And Lord willing, in our next lesson, we'll begin to look at that period between the Testaments. We'll probably take several lessons to cover that, because there's a lot of information. So I hope this lesson has been beneficial, and hope you'll join me again.